Thank you, everyone, and welcome to this wonderful, wonderful venue at the Swan Canoe Club. And I'd like to thank Cameron McDivitt very, very much for introducing us to the Swan Canoe Club and this amazing facility. So if anyone is thinking about needing a location or a wonderful facility to hire, this is what they do. But it is just wonderful, and I'm so glad that tonight the sunset was beautiful with the still water and not too much wind for everyone to enjoy the lovely location on the river. I do need a few more thank yous for tonight to my colleague Dr. Jeff Bremer, who will speak in the middle section, and all the multitude of people from the various groups. That's the Dwelling Up Discovery Forest Defenders Group, the Jarrahdale Forest Protectors, and also from the CAPS, which is the Citizens Alliance for Positive Solutions, that are concerned with the refineries, and everybody here has helped put the night together. And particularly the three groups that are in the Northern Jarrah Forest Alliance are the three groups that I have mentioned, but we are very much supported by two other organisations, and that's West Australian Forest Alliance, WAFA for most people, and the Wilderness Society, and both of those groups have helped considerably in the details of putting tonight together. So thank you to all our partners as well. And I would like to acknowledge the custodians of the land on which we are tonight. That's the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. And I think we probably need to reflect, especially as we are an environmentalist group in every way, and this is the Northern Jarrah Forest is country, and it's our country too. And we certainly have much to learn from the original custodians when it comes to looking after country. So let's... Thank you. So we are the Northern Jarrah Forest Alliance. We are a grassroots community group launching a campaign to prevent the approval of the largest bauxite mine on Earth in the largest Jarrah forest on Earth. And you'll find out more about numbers and size and that later on. But I do want to emphasise that we are really an alliance of community groups, because the bauxite mining has continued along the Darling Range since 1961, and many of these towns have really been almost viewed as sort of like collateral to the business of bauxite mining. And so now for the first time we have all joined together. Just the program for tonight, I will do the introductions. Jeff is going to talk about environmental impacts, and then I'm going to talk about particularly the economic and social impacts, and then most important at the end, what can we do? We are not powerless, we do have hope, and we can do something. The people here will have very varying different understanding of this issue. So some will have to forgive me if I'm a little bit repetitive, but it is a very complex issue. In 1961, the WA government signed a state agreement with Alcoa. At the time, the state was not in good shape economically. Charlie Court was perceived to be doing really good things for the state, creating employment, building the Kwinana refinery. This was a really positive move for the state at the time, and few people would have really understood the long-term implications at the time. And to give Alcoa its due, it has been a company that has contributed considerably in terms of employment and economic contribution, although the royalties aren't that great, but over the years it has been a contributor, and there are many, many families whose husbands and sons have worked for Alcoa and believe that they have had a lot to gain from being employed by Alcoa over the years. However, times have changed dramatically, the world has changed, and basically enough is enough. So that is what we're about to do tonight. or to talk about tonight. The other interesting thing that you need to understand about this state agreement is that it's an agreement that would not have been made today. It is an old mining lease, and if you were applying for a new mine today, you wouldn't be getting anything like the very, very generous conditions that were given to Alcoa at the time. The state needed Alcoa, and so the criteria for mining was with very few constraints. Over the years, the Environmental Protection Authority has introduced a few minor modifications that they have had to comply with, but the mining lease still covers, and you'll see on the map that the yellow line is the extent of the Alcoa mineral lease. It goes right up as far as Armidale and down as far as Collie. And so you can see what is currently being mined, what is proposed, and what is already, what has been mined in the past. So it's a very, very large area. The problem is that this mining lease overrides every other use. So we cannot... The only other use is if there was a national park. Now, prior to 1961, there was the Serpentine National Park, so that is still there as a national park. But we cannot, as it stands at the moment, create any more national parks within that area. Now, within that area and around Dwellingup, and I think Jarrahdale too, I'm not sure, Jeremy, there are areas that are declared conservation zones or proposed national parks, but they cannot be declared a national park because the mineral lease overrides all other uses, and that is a major sticking point. So Alcoa is proposing these two new mines. Where's this, Jim? The two new mines are around Dwellingup, and we would say that this is the Dwellingup East mine, but Alcoa call it Hollyoak. Isn't that a lovely name? And then this one around Jarrahdale, which is the southeast of Jarrahdale, we would say that's Jarrahdale, is actually Mayara North. So they are proposing two new mines, and at Pinjarra, where the refinery is, they're proposing an expansion of the refinery production capacity to 5.2 million tonnes per year, which is quite a considerable increase. It's already the largest and will be by much the largest refinery compared to Kwinana and Wagerup, because Alcoa has the three refineries. So that is the situation at the moment. Now, Alcoa does have, it's largely a self-awarded rehabilitation awards a lot of the time, but they do have a very positive reputation internationally for rehabilitation. And to give them their due, they have worked hard and tried over the years. We have gone way back from revegetating with pines, and then they realised, OK, we need to be revegetating with indigenous trees, and then finally it dawned that actually we need to be trying to revegetate with the original forest, which was the Jarrah. But you will learn more about why that doesn't work later on too. So science has improved, or not improved, but has... we just know so much more about trees, how they grow, what's in the topsoil, the whole interconnectedness of what's in the soil, in the roots and the trees, than we would have ever dreamed of even a decade ago. So, and amongst the other things, we know that the homogeneous undergrowth is also more susceptible to bushfire. In terms of governance, we have this state agreement, but Alcoa really has operated without the social licence. They do say, well, community engagement, but the situation for governance is changing. Last year, in November 2020, the government introduced a new concept into the Environmental Protection Assessment Act relating to cumulative impact, which is a huge plus for us because it means that for the first time we can go back to 1961 and have a look at all that cumulative impact for water, bushfire, deforestation, loss of flora, fauna, species, all those issues. It is proving difficult sometimes to get that information, but we certainly have a band of merry people digging up as much as we possibly can. So that happened in 2020, and then we got a public review. So Alcoa was forced to go to the Environmental Protection Authority to have these 2 new mines and Pinjarra refinery approved, which they've never had to do before. Previously, it was simply a subcommittee or a committee within government called the MMLPG. There was no community representation, and that was almost like a rubber stamp each year and for each 5-year plan. But, and we are looking that there will be some independent peer reviews by the EPA, which previously, because Alcoa has such a capacity to pay all the environmental consultants to come up with all the right science, the issue of independence has been very questionable within the EPA. But they're now saying, we now will be able to get some independent peer review. And finally, I think most of you probably would be aware that there was a huge success by WAFA, who have worked so hard for the last 20 or 40 years to finally have native logging in the southwest forests cease with the 2024 forest logging plan. So that is a huge plus. However, what a lot of people in the general public are not aware, they think, okay, no more logging native forests, that's fine, everything's great, hunky-dory. But the 3 exclusions to that are thinning in the forest and bushfire and bauxite mining. So the reason that bauxite mining is excluded is because of that lease. So, Jeff?
Okay, thank you, Jenny. And thank you, everyone, for coming. And I guess Jenny's done the thank yous. But on behalf of myself, I'd like to thank Jenny and Cameron for an enormous amount of work getting this venue and together and this whole concept together, and also all of our sponsors. But I'm going to move on. I've got 7 things to talk about on environmental impact in 20 minutes, if I can manage it. And it's actually going to be a bit of a hard gig to get through all these slides. So I apologise in advance. I'm going to have to go very quickly. I guess I can just give a warning to hang on to your hat as I go as quick as I can, and we'll try and save, be respectful of your time and then save some time over for questions towards the end. Again, a little outline of what I'll be talking about is the impact of forest clearing, followed by impact of climate change, impact of alumina production on environmental water, both of those on water, impact of mining on carbon storage, our loss of biodiversity and some things about the mine pit rehabilitation, fire management and risks, which I think Jenny's going to cover probably better than me. I won't spend too much time on it. And then also something about a vision for the future, and I'll get to that when we get there. So first of all, I'm going to be repeating a bit of what Jenny said, so I won't keep it too long. As Jenny said, there are 2 mines, Myara North, Hollyoak, and down here is another one that's already approved and didn't go through the same processes that this one's seeking, but that's the Larego mine. And we can see here that, in fact, these brown areas, there's 91,000 hectares of forest have been mined and impacted. So that's either an active mine, which is the big, large Huntley mine here, or is been mined and then rehabilitated, which, for instance, is this bit north of the proposed area and all around Jarrahdale, where one of their first mines was. work. What we can see is that the proposals are that there's 27,000 hectares in these two areas. There's also 22,000 hectares in theirs. And actually, roughly over 10 years, these three areas will mine out bauxite at a rate that over that 10 years will be equivalent to the amount of impacted area in the last 50 years, or 50% of that value. So a point I'll be making is that actually the clearing of forest is accelerating, and that was not something that was really put forward in Alcoa's press releases. They were saying that their impact is very light. Okay, moving on. I think just by looking around the faces in the audience, I'm dealing with talking to a lot of people who are already converted. But I think the purpose of our talks is to try and reach out to other people in the community who really, want to get some information. And I hope that I'll try and focus on providing information through the night. So the first thing is, if you didn't know it before, get up in an aeroplane, or you can go actually onto Google Maps and go into satellite view, and you can see the Huntly mine. This is a photo finally given to me by Sue Ellen Davey, who I'm not sure if she's here tonight. Sue Ellen, are you here? Nope. Okay. I think the plain's pretty much above Dwellingup. We've got South Dandalup Dam on the right, North Dandalup Dam here. Serpentine Dam can be barely seen, and Jarrahdale far in the distance. Basically, from this end over here to over here is roughly 25 kilometres. And if we go back to the earlier map, if we go from here down to here, that's about 100 kilometres. And this lease actually extends not just down to Collie, but goes actually right down south towards, in line with Cape Naturalist. Now, I've actually plotted the publicly available data, and it's not that easily got, but mostly from parliamentary questions, on the amount of forest cleared each year. And as I showed in a former slide, in 1965 it was 14 hectares a year, got up to around about, we've got to go on this one. In about 10 years later, it was up around 100 hectares a year, and it's been going up. And according to parliamentary questions and answers from the Minister of Mining, they're up at about 950 hectares a year. It's not what Alcoa is actually saying, but that's official data. So we've got this great acceleration, but this here is the sort of clearing rates that they were talking about in their proposal, in their first submission to the EPA. It doesn't add up when you're actually going to do about 50% of the total area you mined in the last 55 years, in 10 years. It's clearly this curve's going to shoot through the roof. So let's go on. Now, I'm going to skip off this if possible. Hands up anyone who's not seen this picture on the... It won't take too long. It's a time-lapse video from space showing the acceleration of mining just between 1987 and 2016. And thanks to Dave Osborne from Walk GPS who put that video together. Okay, so as I said, if you're talking to someone, just ask them to actually go to this address, www.walkgps.com, well, not .com.com.au, but .com.au, and you'll be able to see this there. Or just go to Google Maps or Apple Maps or whatever, get a satellite view, and you'll see this stuff from space, just as you saw from the aeroplane shot. Now, okay, before we really talk about mining impact, let's talk about the big ticket thing in the environment in this particular area in the Darling Range. And it is actually climate change. Now, in February of this year, there was a paper published by 38 eminent scientists from 29 universities and institutions, and they identified 19 ecosystems in Australia that are showing evidence of ecological collapse. And one of them is the Mediterranean forests and woodlands of Western Australia, right where we are and where Alcoa is operating their mines. Now, what's the main issue when you read the paper and look at their evidence and data? It is actually a drying of the climate and a dropping of the water table. As the water table drops, the big tap roots of the King Jarrah trees just reach down and keep sucking it up at the same rate and performing photosynthesis, which creates oxygen, cellulose and water in the photosynthetic process. And so they're actually transpiring waters through their leaves. In 2010 and 11, there was, if you remember it, a massive string of days over 40 in the summer. There was a big heat wave and a drought. And basically, this is a picture from the back of the Perth Hills. The ABC News article said thousands of trees killed by drought. I'm kind of happy to say they weren't actually killed, a bit like in the movies, but they were severely stressed, and it might be a vision of the future. That was partly due to just running out of water. The water table dropped and those trees weren't getting any water. Now, a little bit of stuff about hydrology. I guess this is the study of movement of water, both above the ground and below the ground. And this little schematic shows basically what a hydrologist would have to take into account to work out how much runoff would go to a stream. It's a complex balance of rainfall, surface water and groundwater flows, and geological structures like types of rock, terrain and vegetation. Essentially, you can't do this water balance unless you know the terrain, the properties of the soil, all of those sorts of things. One explanation won't fit all. But one of the things that happens is when you rip down forest, and in fact even if you log a forest, you start to get regrowth, and that regrowth increases what's called the leaf area index, the amount of losses of water through plant transpiration. And when you get a young forest or a young plantation growing, it'll pull about 3 times the rate of plant transpiration that a mature forest will do. And so that's straightforward. A little bit off the plan, but there's been studies by a number of people in the past decade, and in particular Croton and Reed in 2007 did a hydrology of bauxite mining in the Darling Plateau, and they actually looked at places impacted by mining and compared them to similar catchments that were simply impacted by logging, I guess, because in fact the forest, although we've got a 150-year regrowth cycle, many of those forests have been logged 3 times in the last 150 years. So it is actually quite impacted. I'll move on. And this is just a very quick thing that I want to point out. The runoff to the stream is actually the rainfall, which is around about 1,050 or thereabouts millimetres, and the evaporation, which includes that plant transpiration, and the gap is the amount of rain that will run off into the streams, either through groundwater or on top of the ground. And what we can see is in 1950 there was about 233 millimetres of effective rainfall that were going off into the streams. By 1975 to 2000 that had dropped to 150, and in 2001 to 2008 it had dropped to 75 millimetres. So in fact the runoff into the Wollongong Dam catchment has dropped 70% since 1975. So you can see that this drying of the climate results in less water going to our dams, and of course, I'll go back, and of course, no surprise, 48% of Perth's water supply is supplied by desalination plants now. In fact, if we had the 1975 climate, we wouldn't need any desalination. Perth uses 300 gigalitres a year, and they had a capacity of 400 gigalitres a year at that time, running off into the streams. And as you recall, everyone used to sort of run a book on which dam was it? Mundaring Weir would overflow. We all used to see that, and then suddenly it stopped overflowing. Okay, so what we have is 91,000 hectares that are impacted. In fact, in this, you'll see that there's about 30,000 hectares have actually been clear felled, and then there is all this sort of stranded habitat in between that's also been heavily logged. And basically, the effect on that runoff is about 50 millimetres of rain per annum. Now, this is Wollongong Dam that hasn't been affected, so there's 75 millimetres of rain being delivered into the dam, and then if you mine that area, that'll drop 50 millimetres and only be 25 millimetres delivering to the dam. And so Frank Bettini, who's basically spokesman for the Institute of Foresters, did this calculation that I'm referring to, and the impact for all of that brown mining there is about 45 gigalitres a year. If you put that into desalinated water costs, the value of that's between $91 to $137 million a year. Desalinated water from a dam costs about 60 cents a kilolitre. Desalinated water costs between $2 and $3 a kilolitre. And what we get is, as consumers, is a shandy of those two things at about $1.62 a kilolitre. Okay, now, so that's one of the water impacts that comes from mining. The other one is that obviously alumina production uses water. And how much is that? Well, Alcoa will tell you about all their individual refineries and how many tonnes they're using, and but not a lot about the cumulative impact of all those. Jenny mentioned 5.2 million tonnes at Pinjarra, but in fact, when that mine, the two operating mines now, which are Huntly and Willowdale, mine 37 million tonnes a year, and they produce 9 million tonnes of alumina. There's roughly 2 tonnes of water per tonne of alumina, and so that's about 18 gigalitres per annum, and that is about 6% of Perth's water supply. And I should say, I didn't put what the percentage of water supply. Oh, sorry, there it is. 15% of Perth's water supply from transpiration losses. Okay, so when we add those two together, we get 61 gigalitres of loss of water per year. That's 21% of the Perth Kalgoorlie water supply of 300 gigalitres for all businesses and a population of 2 million. And if you want to quantify and imagine what that water is, it turns out that the Swan River Canning river system is about 130 gigalitres, so that loss there represents about 47% of the entire Perth Canning river system. It's a lot of water. And, if we use that $2 to $3 a kilolitre, we get, an impact of, 127 to 175 million a year. That's environmental water that either the environment doesn't get or our dams don't get. Not all of the mining is in the catchment of dams, although they do impact on those catchments. But quite frankly, Water Corporation should be charging them for that. Okay, we're moving on to carbon. Carbon storage in mature forest is a bit of an easy one to explain. Even if you look at the IPCC reports, they'll tell you that regrowth forest of any kind takes up more carbon out of the atmosphere than an old-growth forest or a mature forest. And that's true. And, of course, there's so many impacted areas around the world that actually re-vegetating them and regrowing, forests and woodlands is an effective way of capturing carbon. But it's not effective to cut it down. In fact, on a study of temperate eucalypt forests, in which, again, they looked at logging versus protection, the above-ground carbon that was captured it takes roughly 150 years to regrow that forest to get back to the carbon level that it actually had in that mature forest to begin with. So once you do a clearance like this, it's 150 years to get that carbon back, even if you've got world-class rehabilitation. So, and this is one of the IPCC recommendations, is stop foresting. And I'm glad that COP's 26, is it? They brought out a statement to protect forests, and we hope that'll have a big result. Okay, so basically what the argument is, we want to protect this stored carbon from something like this, 125 years or 150, whatever, to get it back. Now, loss of biodiversity and pit rehabilitation. I think there's a couple of perspectives, and the simple and easy one, and not necessarily the right one, but that's the thing, is there's not one size fits all, is you can go and find a whole lot of failed rehabilitation efforts in Alcoa's replanting. And so this one on the left is Mundalup near Jarrahdale, and the tree plantations show a severe depletion of the herbaceous understory. And you can see that this is not a habitat for either ground plants, whether it's orchids or grass trees, or mammal species. They're all destroyed, and it's a bit of a dead zone of thin pole trees growing up 25 years later. This, on the other hand, on the left is I suppose what I could call a healthy Jarrah forest, but this is one that has been logged at least twice in the last 150 years, and possibly 3 times. But you can see, even with logging, with its destruction, there's a lot of understory species here. There's, logs and habitat and things for animals, and so they're two different things. That's easier to say, well, I don't want this, I want that. That's a pretty easy argument. But we've got this other thing, and this is the other perspective, is that, Alcoa's made a claim to a multi-decade record of mine site rehabilitation, and is the first mining company in the world to achieve 100% plant species richness in a rehabilitated mine site areas. Now, what I'd like to say is Alcoa has achieved a lot of success in achieving this species richness, and they've been working very hard at it for at least 40 years, and they have a great number in their latest plantations of what's called recalcitrant species that don't seed by fire, but they've got them planted. So things like grass trees, black boys, whatever you want to call them, they end up succeeding in planting them, but of course these particular grass trees, I'm not expert on this, but they'd be a minimum of 50 years, maybe even 100 years still. They're very slow growing. And so what they've got on the plantations is just a sprout, if you like. And so the real problem with the plantation is it might have species richness, but it doesn't actually replace mature forest. If we get that argument about carbon, it also has this great mixture of tree species and understory species that are all competing, and the actual forest vegetation complex probably took thousands of years to become stable. So it's a bit like starting your own garden. You've got to weed it, you've got to take care of it as the things that you love grow up. Now, the other problem with it is, and I'm going to do a bit of flipping around, these areas here have no mature forest reserve areas that can protect habitat for the animals that exist there. They knock out everything and then have these stranded habitats all throughout it. So there's no north, south, east, west, egress or movement or corridors. Now, the argument is, yes, that there's a species richness there, but that vegetation complex will take 150 years before it gets anywhere near stable. It's a bit for the animal species that depend on it. Well, they can take a European holiday and, come back in 80 or 100 years and then start their family and the kids, when their new home's ready. It's that sort of thing. It's absolutely essential to preserve mature forest habitat if you want to have habitat for everything there. And the other thing is that Alcoa's lease and their operations at the rate they're going will definitely finish by 2045. And then, we'll actually have a century or more of forest management, of managing these plantations. And for instance, forest thinning, which is cutting out the thin pole, close packed growth of trees or understory, can cost $1,500 to $2,000 an acre. If that is applied across the whole affected area of 91,000 hectares, that's in the order of $137 to $182 million. Will that be just a one-off cost? No, it'll probably be once every 25 years, something like that, maybe 30. So that's an ongoing cost that the people of Western Australia have to bear after Alcoa leaves. Now, biodiversity, I've mentioned already, so I'll keep this quick. Basically, these areas do not have contiguous mature forest habitats preserved for these animals. Essentially, you will see that there are little bits of green in between all these mining pits, but there's no easy way for animals or other, habitats to sort of propagate. And this is probably, maybe says it all, that the Forest Products Commission, the people doing forestry have a tradition of identifying what they call habitat trees, and these trees have breeding hollows for cockatoos or mammal species, this sort of thing. And what happens when Alcoa does their operations, the Forest Products Commission goes in and marks the habitat trees, and then they can take everything else. And so this is actually a 200 hectare clearing. It's probably the biggest one, I don't know if it's on the planet, but it's the biggest one in WA. It's just near Carnet Prison Farm, and there's this ridiculous idea that somehow you're preserving habitat with one tree stuck there in a no man's land. So I don't think I have to argue the case on that.
It's the biggest mine in the world.
Sorry?
It's the biggest bauxite mine.
It's definitely the biggest bauxite mine, yeah. But that's the biggest pit and the biggest bauxite mine. Yeah. Okay. This is a catchment north of the Serpentine Dam, and I just have to remark that these places have a deep and lasting spiritual value for all people. You can recognise it when you see it. And this beautiful area is just right on the edge of the restricted protective zone of the dam. We had to have special permission from Water Corp to get in there. And this is all part of that mineral lease, and Alcoa believe under the 61 Act or whatever that they do actively already mine in catchments around the Huntley mine. So all of this is up for grabs, and the main thing I really want to say is that apart from environment and species and all of this, we as human beings are part of this environment, and these areas have deep aesthetic, spiritual value for all of us. Doesn't matter whether you're religious or not, it means something. And that, just as Jenny says, there's beautiful areas around dwelling up. There's stuff north of the Serpentine Dam. The only stuff left, they approached it from the south. Now they want the north, which is this area. Okay, I've spoken about aesthetic values, and because of time, I'm just going to flip on. But clearly everyone loves mountain biking, which is the Mundabidi Trail, which is already getting blocked by the mine. Then there's the Bibbulmun track, which has been moved several times, and here are some views from Serpentine Dam, which I'll talk about soon. Mining, revegetation and fire. I'm going to go through this very quickly and just say I've not addressed the cost of fire management. Please see Jenny's talk, or oh good, what's that, forest? Oh, I don't know what forest thinning, forest thin, of rehab, talk about rehab, yeah. But the granddaddy of investigation into fire management in Alcoa's leases was after the 2016 Maroon fire in what is now known as the Ferguson Report. And the key takeouts of that was that there's a whole lot of this thin pole, dense undergrowth vegetation in the rehab areas. Now, you can either say it's failed rehab or it's just rehab that hasn't got 100 years, pruning and work put into it to turn it into something like a forest, the forest that we recognise. And basically the fire front in the Waruna Yarloop fire went through 3 times faster than the logged forest. It was going at 3 kilometres an hour, and that means if you live 1 kilometre from this sort of rehab, you may have as little as 20 minutes to get out once the fire gets going. So, and basically that Commissioner Ferguson found, was critical of Alcoa, and the special inquiry found that Alcoa should be encouraged to undertake best fire management practices. What they did find is that during the fire crews couldn't even get in there because they'd terraced the areas and then put in random bits of rock, so they couldn't get their trucks or their crews in there, and it was just too dangerous to even try and fight the fire. So they just let it rip through, and it went through so fast it threatened Maruna, and it actually took out Yarloop, as we all know. Okay, now constructive vision of the future. I'm just about at the end of my talk. And I think what I really want to say is, do you think I've got this, or we have, Jenny, me, anyone, this great plan for the future? I've got to say it's a work in progress, and it depends as much on you, the community and everyone, to buy into some idea of reimagining the future rather than doing the same things that we've been doing. So the first thing I want to say is that we really do, a constructive vision of the future is essential. Yes, there are people working, directly in mining. It does have an economy around it. It's important that we actually create a future for those people and everyone else. Another question is aluminium. Do we want a world with aluminium, with Alcoa in business, and conservation of our forest and environment? Yes, we want all of those things. So this is not a get Alcoa talk or about Alcoa being the bad guys, but it's about a talk about how we might do things differently while still having an aluminium economy. I've already mentioned that corridors, whether Alcoa gets approval to proceed or not, the reservation of mature forest corridors with north-south, east-west egress for animals is absolutely essential. We're not actually rehabilitating anything if we don't actually have those reserves for our children's future. Water habitat. If we had those reserves, and this is within the mine site area, it's not sufficient to say, well, we've mined here, but we've left this other bit alone. We actually have to preserve, some habitat in the areas of operation. If they do get a go-ahead, there will be mining pits around the periphery of that, and I think one proposal is that some of those mining pits should be converted to water habitats as basically a hedge against climate change and drying. When all the woodlands were cleared in the wheat belt, they didn't just leave it and grow wheat, they put in dams, and they put in collections of water supplies to sustain animals and life out there. And, but I'm an engineer, and something you put in engineering documents, hold means you're not really sure. Hold means we've got to wait till there's some stakeholder review and environmental review and a whole bunch of other people that have got to make some decisions about that. So, this is ideas for a vision of the future. It's not, definitive. Transition. About Alcoa, they employ 4,370 people, direct. But the thing is, all that's going to end in 2045, and we'll have a severely depleted environment to boot. and they'll all be out of a job. So we're really talking 24 years away. It's not really long in terms of economic change. And so what we really have to do is build an industry on forest conservation and tourism and employ at least that number, which is actually fairly easy in the tourism and conservation business, to basically create the industries and jobs and economy. But it does mean we have to start now. We can't just go, oh, we'll plan this for 2045 when there's hardly any forest left. And finally, circular economy. The world still needs aluminium and our natural environments to be preserved. And we can create the jobs around forest conservation and tourism. And we also have to face the fact that we have to restructure alumina and aluminium and many of the world's resource companies from the consume and throw away cycle, and that recycling and conservation is essential. So making that constructive vision of the future gets a lot more complicated when we actually have to start changing our behaviour and habits also. I've just got two other slides now I just want to put to you. First of all, Japan has a tradition of forest conservation that started in the 15th century. Some people don't know, but in fact Japan was going through an ecological crisis in the 1600s in which they'd run out of wood. And the solution then at that time was that the shogun, being very jealous, he wanted the wood for his ships and all of that, basically said, all the forest belong to me and none of you bastards can have any of it. He appointed prefects to guard each section of the forest. They counted each tree and so forth. And you might be familiar with that Japanese housing with the thin pieces of wood and the rice paper walls. That comes from that era where commoners were only allowed a very small amount of wood to make their homes. And so they had to make do with this very small amount of wood and construct these rice paper walled homes. But the result is really some of the world's most stunning old growth forests in developed nations. So maybe that's where we should be going too. Now, here's another thing. This took hours and hours to get there, but here we go. So what role does Alcoa have and how does the aluminium industry work? Well, it's actually a good industry by comparison to many others, and 75% of the world's aluminium is recycled. And in fact, so what is the demand for bauxite and alumina? Where is it? And it turns out single-use throwaway products is roughly the lost 25%. To give you an example, Australia consumes 3 billion aluminium cans each year and we recycle 56% of them. The remaining 44% amounts to about roughly 20,000 tonnes of aluminium that goes into landfill. And that's enough to make 264 jumbo jets. But we're only about 1.7% of the world economy. So worldwide we consume about 180 billion cans a year, and if the rest of the world is throwing away about the same amount that we do, and I don't know if they do, but just a hypothetical, that's about 1.2 million tonnes a year that gets just of aluminium that gets thrown in the trash can. And that's, oh damn, I'm sorry, I've put 264. It's 17,000 jumbo jets. Okay, I'm sorry, this got finished about 4 o'clock. Okay, let's talk about 150 years of logging, 55 years of mining. In that period, we've lost numbats and ringtail possums. Similarly, our cockatoos have lost their habitat and their food supplies. And it's easy, as I said, to sort of just say it's all bad old Alcoa. There's some very significant climate change effects taking place. But the argument really is that this is a severely impacted habitat. It's a world biodiversity hotspot, which means it's got 1,500 plant species in it, or more than 1,500 plant species, but it also is 70% depleted from what it was in species abundance. So basically, European settlers have knocked the whole environment right throughout Australia, and the Jarrah Forests is one of them. We don't have that much of it left to preserve. Okay, so then now I'm going to hand over, and I just want to make my final and last remark. I haven't had time to go through all the details and all of the stuff, but while I was going down Kingsbury Drive, and Jenny will talk about Jarrahdale Forest Protectors have put out a self-drive tour that you can do yourself to satisfy yourself, and thank you Diana and Jeremy for pulling that all together, Diana Blacklock and Jeremy Perret. But this is the view from the northern side, the untouched side of Serpentine Dam at the children's playground. And interestingly enough, from the cafe, you just see all the beautiful forest. But once you get down at a lower level at the children's cafe, that's what the kids see. And you know what kids are like, they don't pay that much attention. But the irony of it just struck me that, you know, we're having these kids looking at the future. They've encroached into the catchment, and now they want to take that great big chunk of area in the north with that, where that beautiful exquisite stream is, and, you know, start doing their thing there as well. So with that, thank you very much, and I'll hand over to Jenny to the reception.
The goal is for Alcoa to not be approved for 2 new mines and refinery expansion. Is that better? Okay, just very, very briefly, because we haven't got a lot of time left, but there are, as Jeff had pointed out, a lot of economic costs that are not necessarily obvious to everybody immediately. Certainly water, and Jeff has really covered in detail the water costs, and particularly in terms of the need for desalination plants. You know, we do know that because the refinery, the Kwinana refinery was so contaminated after their tailings dam that the industries in that area have had to use or buy their own desalinated water. So we are going to be having to see more and more desalination water that's more and more costly. Roads. You'll notice around the areas around Jarrahdale and Dwellingup, we've got some very fancy big new roads, because you have to have good roads for trucks to transport either to refineries, whether they go to Wagerup or to the Pinjarra refinery or to Kwinana. And also in the area we do have mining trucks coming through from Boddington as well, with the Newmont gold mine, and there's other bauxite mines from South 22, and Worsley doesn't come through our area, but just looking at a diversion road to go to avoid the towns is $60 million. So it is a huge expense, and that doesn't include the costs for minor roads to get in and out of the mines, although obviously Alcoa do pay for when they make their own tracks. Energy. We could go on at great length about energy consumption. It's just sufficient to say that the whole process of transforming raw bauxite into aluminium, and we don't convert the aluminium into alumina, the alumina into aluminium here, that's done at the smelter in Portland, but just that's a mistake. It should be it's transforming the bauxite into alumina, because you transfer, the bauxite becomes the alumina, and then the alumina goes to the smelter to become aluminium. And it's very, very energy intensive, and Alcoa is definitely right up there in one of the major energy users in the state. They do actually use gas, not coal, whereas the Worsley refinery does use coal, so their carbon emissions are greater, but it's still a very significant factor in terms of energy. And forestry, the rehabilitated areas are densely painted, require thinning. Alcoa says this is not our responsibility, so the cost of thinning is estimated from 135 to 180 million for 91,000 hectares. Fire, this is again a huge topic. The difficulty of trying to give a presentation like tonight is that this is such a complex issue. There are so many different areas of impact and so many areas of impact that interact with each other that it really takes a whole scientific seminar to go into everything. So what we're trying to give you tonight is just an overview of almost not quite dot points of what those areas of impact are. But certainly tourism. The most important thing in terms of farming is the threat to the bee species. Those of you that have seen Cry of the Forest would have seen the impact of the forest or the destruction of the forest from the bee industry. And my only comment here is that anyone who loves their honey or who loves their Jarrah honey, if you go in and you think, OK, I need more Jarrah honey, you will be absolutely horrified. A 500 gram pot of Jarrah honey now costs $60. And so this will just become like gold. And so this is the impact of loss of the forest on the beekeeping industry. Another area is spills. There are always from time to time spills for various reasons in the process of mining. Some occur into the streams because somebody has spilt some toxic chemical. Maybe it's to do with the Phosgene stuff that they use for putting out for the fires, or in the actual tailings dam themselves. And recently, in February this year, there was a spill of 7 million litres from the Wagerup Dam, which did get a little bit of press, but for some reason the safety people did not actually arrive on the scene to look at it until 3 days later. But we do hear from Alcoa employees from time to time that there has been a spill, but otherwise it's not necessarily known. This is just to emphasise about water, because the hydrology is a massive impact from all the various areas that Jeff has talked about. So everybody who lives in the area knows that our water table is decreasing at more than the rate that you would think from climate change. And the loss of the flora and fauna species, the Darling Range used to be full of numbats, cockatoos on the endangered list, ringtail possums, it's not mentioned here, but the western quoll also in endangered numbers. And I'm just wondering how many people would have even noticed the photo of the quokka on our poster down there. How many people even know that there are quokka colonies around both Jarrahdale and Dwellingup? But unfortunately, where they used to be in their hundreds in the colonies, the numbers left in those colonies now is just down into the dozens. So they are really severely, severely endangered in the Darling Range. So I've covered the environmental, or Jeff has covered all the environmental impacts very well. But we need to think about how it affects recreation, and we've got the hiking, biking, all the paddlers here paddling in the Murray River, and camping, family camping, agriculture, horticulture, orchards. There are a lot of orchards around the Dwellingup area. If we had more access to more land, there would be more orchards. It's still a relatively high rainfall area to be able to, and because of the cold, you are able to grow fruit that you can't necessarily grow in areas north of Perth. Tourism is really just a budding industry that could be so much. It really, again, the Murray Shire has been enormously helpful in contributing to try and get the mountain trails, cycling trails established between Collie and Dwellingup and eventually to Jarrahdale. And this is an enormous industry, as apparently the largest increasing sport in the world is mountain biking. It terrifies me, but anyway, it's very popular. But every other aspect of tourism, ecotourism, is impacted. As the CEO of the Murray Shire says, there is all this terrific development that has happened in his shire in terms of investment in tourist centre, trails, etc., but it's all government money. There is no private major investment until there is certainty about the mines. So really, all future development is just at a standstill until there is some certainty about the future. Nobody's going to invest if you're going to have a mine next door. And so the science, there's a lot of science that is happening and could be much further produced in terms of the bushfire research. There's also within the Murray Shire, they have established the Institute for Bushfire Research at North Dandalup, and they are looking at training people in terms of cultural burning and Aboriginal burning practices, and looking at bushfire research as well as the bushfire management. So there's a lot to be learned and a lot to be yet put into practice in that area in terms of bushfire management. And education. How many of you kids would have or had children or grandchildren who've been to the outdoor ed camps around Nanga Brook or areas within Dwellingup? And there used to be Icy Creek just at the edge of the Lane Pool Reserve that was for students from government schools, and we used to have 5,000 students per year who would use those campgrounds. But unfortunately, Alcoa was mining next door, so they had to close that, and it hasn't been reopened. So the impact on the capacity to utilise the need for outdoor education generally for students and families is quite huge. Other social impacts is heritage, particularly around Jarrahdale, and Dwellingup too, because all those old timber towns that we really don't necessarily visit or necessarily have even a lot of information about are out there in the forest, and that loss of the heritage of the timber industry for the last 150 years. And you might say, well, yes, they were cutting down the trees, but it was our heritage, and that's what has happened. And we need to value that, and we need to value Indigenous heritage. Prevention of Indigenous use and exploration of Indigenous cultural value has not been encouraged at all in these areas. Physical health, impact of noise, dust, toxic waste in streams and groundwater. The CAPS group is particularly interested in the health issues surrounding the refineries, and the Doctors for the Environment are also very interested in looking at this area, and they have ever since the 80s with all the health concerns around the Wage Rut refinery. Remember when Erin Brockovich came out and stirred up? So the impact of the physical health issues is not insignificant, and with the increase in the refinery at Pinjarra, CAPS are actually at the moment trying to get some money to get research done on cancer numbers within the area, because the previous research did not include all the criteria that they needed to. And mental health. This has come up as a really big issue within the area, and we're currently doing a survey about mental health of people in the area, because people in these small towns have lived long-term under the threat of what is the future? Is my property going to be next to the next to be mined, or the next door to the next one to be mined? It's not a good feeling, and when you wake up to the noise of the blasting, the conveyor belt that goes 24 hours a day, and you can hear it for miles, the noise of the trucks going through the town, it's just a constant reminder, and seeing those logging trucks with huge circumference of trees going right through the main street has a very, very significant impact. And so the mental health is not to be underestimated at all. This is Vince Puccio is the president of CAPS, And I put this slide in because it reminds me of the person who runs the Christchurch camp, and he said to me, well, here I've got all these boys learning about the environment, outdoor ed, etc. But what do they think when they wake up in the morning to the noise of the blasting? That's not exactly learning about our environment, is it? So what is the vision for the future of the Jarrah Forest and the Darling Range? We need to think really big, and we need to think laterally, and we've got this area that needs to be thought about in a different way. If it is not approved, then what is going to happen? What will this forest be? What are we really going to leave our children? So we would like the life in the Northern Jarrah Forest becomes a destination as important to Kings Park and Rottnest to WA, because it's only a very short drive from Perth. The potential in terms of both international tourism, day trippers, people who come to Perth for a couple of days, haven't got time to go down to Margaret River, but everybody would have time to spend a day or two in beautiful forest, engaging in the multitude of forest activities and looking at nature within a very short distance of Perth. So we need to think about how can we turn all those impacts that I've just talked about and think about how we can turn them into positives in some way, and so that the economic potential of the Jarrah Forest really outweighs the bauxite mining in the future. And that's what we need to demonstrate to government, is that the economic potential is much greater than the cost benefits of mining. So let's go back and just think about if we had recreation, and tourism, what are some really great ideas? And we need everybody here to be able to think about, what would you like to see? Would it be more family camping? Would it be maybe a really upmarket boutique eco-tourism hotel like Silky Oaks in Queensland or something? There is a great potential for both high-end tourism and both family-level tourism if we had more access to the forest in terms of all those recreational nature activities. Certainly for agriculture, there's vast potential there. Also the Murray Shire, again it sounds as if I'm plugging the Murray Shire, but they've also just started a centre for agri-food innovation, so where they're looking at people to look at the processing of food in a different way to create new materials or new types of ways of marketing and using food in the area. And science, if you think about medical science, how many of our medicines come from plants? There's a huge opportunity for research in these areas of the forest or species that have not necessarily been fully investigated in terms of what benefit they might be. And education, loads and loads of opportunities for schools to participate in the outdoor education programs. And heritage, we could have, what springs to my mind is things like those who might have visited America, and there are many of those real-life villages about what life used to be like in those days, and in terms of the timber towns, that sort of thing. There is opportunity to be able to demonstrate both our non-Indigenous heritage and, in terms of Indigenous heritage, interpretive trails, exploration and tours in all sorts of ways in terms of us learning about Indigenous heritage. Physical health, if we take out the toxic dust and the noise and whatever, our physical health is definitely going to improve, but also the mental health aspects, because you think of, if Jeff mentioned about the woods, the trees in Japan, and it was Japan who invented the term forest breathing and the mental health aspects of just walking in the forest or being in the forest, and all the scientific evidence for how incredibly useful just being in nature is for us. So we're actually having an art exhibition in Dwelling Up in December, and it's called Nostalgia, because this is the distress that's produced by environmental change impacting on people while they're directly connected to their environment. So now the really important part, how can we stop this? How can we ensure that all these changes can be reversed into positives? Just bear with me, because this is actually a really important part. What are we going to do about it? Now, first of all, never underestimate the word of mouth. If every single person in this room walks out of here and says, I am going to talk to at least 5 other people that I know about what you have seen and listened to tonight, it is a very, very powerful means, and we need to inform the people of Perth and the people of WA, because it's absolutely surprising, or not surprising, how little people are aware of bauxite mining in our Northern Jarrah Forest and in the whole Darling Range. It is a shock to most people, so we really need to be getting the word out. Social media, all the various means of social media that you can use, and we can also be a little bit more targeted about the way we use social media. Letters to the editor. It's always, it might not get printed, but quite often, whether it's your local papers, Sunday Times, Perth Now, any magazine that you are connected with, just write a letter to the editor. You only need to express your feelings from what you have listened to tonight. And then the other thing that you can do is, because it's very hard to walk out of here and do something on your own and think, oh yes, I really must do something. But really, if you go out of here with someone that you came with, or you talk to it about someone in your family, your work colleague, or someone you know, to actually form a little group of 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 and say, okay, we are going to do something together, and we might be writing a letter to the editor, we might be writing a letter to a politician, or we might be visiting a politician. But it really is a help if everybody has someone to not necessarily nag, but say, well, what are you doing? I was going to do this. So the letters to the politicians and departmental heads are very important, and a lot of people have said to me, well, what do I say? I don't know what to do. I don't know what to ask them. So you need to contact us, any of our groups, and say, this is my local member. So maybe everyone could get out their phones now and put in a reminder to yourself to say, okay, I am going to contact a politician, or it's a reminder to yourself that, have I done something? So that everybody goes out of here with the desire to do at least one thing. We can help you with those letters to politicians and departmental heads. There are a lot of questions that we can help you ask, things that would be pertinent things. There are certain politicians we know who are more receptive than others, and others who are less receptive, and depending on what department, if they're cabinet ministers, we can help you frame specific questions around whether it is about water or education or Indigenous affairs or whatever. We would help you provide that material for you to go along. Become a volunteer. There's all sorts of things that everybody can do to help. It might be just doing a little bit of desk research on a topic, or helping on a stall, helping with social media. There's a lot of jobs if anybody does have a bit of time to volunteer, even if it's only an hour or so at a time. And provide positive solutions. We really want you to think about just blue sky. What can the Northern Jarrah Forest be? What uses and innovations and things that you could think of. It might be something like you saw all those lovely furry animals and you didn't know that we had quokkas, but what about a subset of the Perth Zoo? Every other state in Australia has at least two zoos, not every other, but New South Wales and Victoria have a couple of zoos, like the Wagga Zoo for wild animals. Why couldn't we have a zoo in the Northern Jarrah Forests for native animals that's just for native animals? It would be a huge tourist draw card. So we want brainstorming ideas amongst you to come forward and say, because if we can posit those ideas to government and say these are the things that you can do, then that's really, really helpful. And last of all, become a donor. Obviously, we do need money to do all sorts of things. I'll just run through very quickly. Planning a bushwalk in the next 50 years, but we've had some ideas about the sorts of things that we could use. Cameron McDivitt has been fantastic in designing some sort of ideas about how we could posit mainly some outdoor advertising. Things like, what about the quokkas? Everyone likes the quokkas, and we all know that once there are no more quokkas, they actually can't swim to Rottnest. And outdoor advertising, it would be, I don't know that Transperth would allow us to have it on a bus, but certainly we can do stickers on cars, a button, or even on your front lawn. Maybe we might do a big march, but we all need to do something. So just before, I do want to finish one thing. So I just want to say that Alcoa is a successful global company. It's based in the US and it's got access to the very best PR and strategists. Tonight might have seemed like a bit of a depressing evening, and it might seem like it's a David and Goliath challenge ahead, but I want to invoke the Queen's speech to Glasgow, to the delegates at Glasgow. And the Queen, with some alterations, has said, "History has shown that when people come together in a common cause, there is always room for hope. It is the hope of this evening that we do not pass up this opportunity and that we leave tonight with a determination, a desire and a plan to recognise that the time for words has now moved to a time for action. We're not doing this for ourselves, but for our children and our children's children. So thank you, each and every one, for coming tonight."